I never thought I'd be cleaning someone else's house at this stage of my life. But after the divorce and the bills spiraling up faster than my strength could rebuild, I didn't have the luxury of pride I just needed. Work something steady, quiet, and enough to keep the lights on. So when I saw a listing for a housekeeping job in a quiet neighborhood, I took it without thinking. Twice. The house was large, elegant, almost cold in its perfection. The kind of place you expect to feel small in. But I needed the income, and I needed the distraction. The owner wasn't what I expected, he answered. The door in a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but kind, mid to late 30s, quiet voice, firm handshake. He introduced himself as Daniel. He wasn't rude or arrogant, just distant, as if he were always somewhere else in his mind. He gave me a brief tour of the house, explaining what he needed done weekly. Downstairs mostly, he said. Don't worry about the upstairs. Just keep the living room, kitchen, and study tidy. It felt like there were unspoken rules in there. But I didn't ask questions. I was just grateful for the opportunity. The first few days passed without much interaction. I came in, did my tasks, and left. He worked from home, always tucked away in his study, with a laptop and a mug of black coffee that I'd find half-drunk hours later. I started to notice little things, the way the piano in the corner collected dust, the untouched wine glasses on the shelf, and a photo on the hallway wall of a younger Daniel, with a woman who smiled like she believed in forever. I never asked it. Wasn't my place, but I felt the quiet weight that hung in that house, as if the walls remembered better days. Despite the silence, I never felt unwelcome. He'd nod in appreciation, or leave a thank you note on the counter once, after I'd organized a chaotic cupboard without being asked. He left a small bouquet of flowers with a note that read, I noticed, thank you. It was unexpected. No one had thanked me like that in a long time. Not since my old life ended. I started arriving a little earlier, taking my time. In the mornings I'd catch glimpses of him reading on the back patio, or lost in thought by the window. There was acidness in him. I recognized a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from losing someone and not knowing how to let them go. I saw it in myself too, sometimes in the mirror. One afternoon he passed me on his way. You're doing a great job, he said, pausing for a second. I mean it. I smiled, not used to compliments that felt so sincere. He looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. He just nodded and walked out the door. Still, that small moment stayed with me longer than it should have at night. I found myself thinking about him, not in a romantic way. At least, not then, but in a curious, unsettled way. Who was he really? What happened in that house before I arrived? Why did everything seem frozen in time? I didn't ask questions. I just kept doing my job. But there was a pull I couldn't ignore. Something about that house felt like a place where healing hadn't yet happened. And something about the way he looked at me briefly, cautiously, made me feel like maybe he wasn't entirely closed off to letting someone in. I kept things professional. I couldn't afford to complicate things. But the truth was, being in that house gave me something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose. It wasn't just about dusting shelves or folding blankets. It was about being seen again, even in the smallest ways, and for someone who'd been invisible in her own life for so long, that meant everything. So I showed up, I worked hard, and I wondered silently, what might happen if two people, both quietly broken in different ways, kept crossing paths inside a house that seemed to be waiting for something to change. I didn't know it then, but that question would soon find its answer. And when it did, everything would shift. It started with a simple question. Would you mind helping me with something upstairs? Daniel asked one afternoon, his voice softer than usual. I paused. He'd never invited me to the second floor before. I hesitated for a second, unsure if it was part of the job or something else. But something in his eyes, something tentative, not demanding, made him nod. Of course, I said. As we walked up the wide staircase, I noticed how different it felt. The upstairs hallway was filled with warm light family pictures on the wall shelves of books, and a faint scent of cedar. It didn't match the coldness of the downstairs it felt lived in. Real. He led me into a room at the end of the hall. His study, he said. It wasn't the one he used for work. Downstairs, this one had more character. An old desk overflowing books, a worn leather chair, and a large window that looked out over a quiet backyard. Papers were stacked everywhere. Old photo albums were half open and dust-coated nearly. Every surface I've been meaning to organize it for years, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I just couldn't bring myself to. There was assilence between us, not awkward, but fully understood more than I let on as he began tidying. He joined me going through papers, occasionally sharing little stories. That was my father's, he said. Holding up a fountain pen, he used it every day until the ink ran dry. We found a box of old postcards, letters, and keepsakes. He smiled at some sighed. To others I didn't cry, but he offered pieces of his life anyway. His love for classical music, his years working over, sees how he bought the house with someone he thought he'd grow old. With an odded listen, there was no judgment, just two people sorting through memories. One box at a time from that day on. The upstairs became less off-limits. He'd ask me to help with small tasks here and there, reorganizing books, dusting shelves, finding a place for keepsakes he couldn't throw away. And with each visit, the conversation grew, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about life, and occasionally about pain. He told me about Emily. She'd been gone for 3 years, cancer, swift, cruel, and without mercy. He spoke about her not with bitterness, but with reverence, like someone who had made peace with the loss, but not the silence it left behind. I found myself opening up too. I shared parts of my own story, not the painful details, but enough about how I'd lost more than a marriage. How I was rebuilding from pieces, and how hard it was to be strong when no one was watching. He listened the way people rarely do anymore, fully patiently. Not once did he interrupt or try to fix it. Had just let me speak slowly. The boundaries that once defined us, employer and employee, man and woman, stranger and stranger, began to blur. He started offering tea in the late afternoons, and we'd sit for a few minutes before I left. The silences were no longer heavy. They were comfortable, familiar. There were smiles, quiet laughter, and stories that lingered long after I walked out the door. One evening, as I was heading out, he walked me to the door. "You've brought life back to this place," he said quietly. I didn't realize how much it needed that. I smiled, unsure how to respond. But the words stayed with me, echoing in my chest. It wasn't a love story yet, at least not the kind with grand gestures or whispered promises. It was something gentler, a connection, forming in the smallest cracks of our routines, a comfort we didn't name. And even though nothing had been said or acted upon, there was a shift I couldn't ignore. Something about the way he looked at me, like he saw not just a woman doing a job, but a person he respected, maybe even needed, made me wonder if healing sometimes came disguised as a second chance. Still, I was careful. I reminded myself not to read too much into it. I was there to work, to rebuild, not to fall, for a man whose heart had already been broken. But no matter how many times I told myself that there was something undeniable growing between us, something soft, patient, and real, something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but maybe it was exactly what I needed. It was a Thursday evening when everything shifted. The sky had turned gray all day, and by the time I was finishing up in the kitchen, rain began tapping softly. Against the windows, I reached for my coat, ready to leave, when Daniel appeared in the doorway. "The storm's getting bad," he said, motioning to the wind picking up outside. "Would you mind staying for dinner just until it settles down?" I hesitated, but the warmth in his voice made it hard to say no. I nodded slowly, placing my bag back down. That night, everything felt quieter, softer, like the house itself was holding its breath. We sat at the small kitchen table. Nothing fancy, just leftover pasta, a bottle of wine he hadn't opened in years, and conversation that didn't try too hard, asked me questions he never had before, not about the chores or the house, but about me, what I Loved what I missed, what scared me. I answered slowly, cautiously, but honestly. And then I asked about that piano. I had seen it 100 times, but never heard a single note come from it. That smiled almost sadly and said, he hadn't played it since Emily passed. She used to sit right there, he whispered. Pointing to the velvet bench, she said it made the house feel alive after dinner. He asked if I'd like to hear something. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He sat at the piano, touched the keys gently, then began to play. Themlity was soft, haunting, filled with something I couldn't describe. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I didn't expect to cry, but I did quietly. The kind of tears you don't even realize are falling until your cheeks feel cold. When have finished. He looked at me not with pity, but with something deeper understanding. Empathy, a quiet recognition that we were both carrying the weight of something we hadn't fully named that night lingered. With me in the days that followed, I found myself thinking about his hands on the piano, the sadness in his smile, and the way he looked at me like I wasn't just a shadow passing through his world. I started questioning my own heart. Was I beginning to feel something? And if I was, did that mean I was betraying everything? I promised myself that I would focus on healing, on being independent, on not needing anyone. Then came the news a friend of mine had connected me to a position at a real estate firm. Better pay, benefits, more stability on paper. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I didn't say anything to Daniel at first. I told myself I'd finish the month. Then move on, clean break, no complications. But nothing is ever that simple. When feelings are involved, he found out through someone else, a mutual contact. I suppose that day he was distant again. The warmth in his voice was gone, replaced by politeness. That felt like a wall. I tried to explain, but he brushed it off. Of course, he said. You should take it. It's a great opportunity. I nodded, but it hurt not because of the job, but because of the way. He looked at me as if everything we'd been building was suddenly undone. The house felt different after that, colder again, quieter. I still did my work, but the connection had faded into something fragile. I wondered if I had imagined it all. Maybe I had mistaken kindness for interest or familiarity, for intimacy. Maybe I had wanted something Toby there because I was lonely. Still part of me. Wanted him to say something. Anything to ask me to stay. Not out of need, but out of want. But he didn't. And I didn't push. We had both built walls for a reason. It just never occurred to me how much it would hurt when his stayed up. I spent that week in quiet reflection. Every room I cleaned felt like a goodbye. Every step I took echoed with memories I didn't realize I'd made. And yet, even through the silence and distance, a small part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. That what we had begun building slowly, quietly, was still there, waiting for one of us to be brave enough to take the next step. My final day at the house arrived faster than I was ready for. I moved through the familiar rooms, slowly letting my fingers trail over surfaces I'd once dusted without thought, now suddenly meaningful. Every corner held a memory, every chair, every light switch, even the scent of the wood polish I used, weekly felt significant. I had come here out of necessity, but I was leaving with something I hadn't expected. Attachment. I checked the clock. Just a few more minutes before I'd say goodbye, and likely never return. Daniel wasn't around. When I arrived, and part of me was relieved. Maybe it was easier that way, no drawn-out farewells, no awkward silences, just a clean end. I left a small note on the kitchen table. Simple words: thank you for everything. I won't forget. I placed the house key next to it, gathered my bag, and walked to the door, but just as I was about to step out, I heard his voice behind me. You were going to leave, without saying goodbye. I turned slowly, surprised to see him standing there, hair slightly tousled, his expression unreadable. He stepped closer, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. Then he spoke again quietly. I should have said something sooner. I didn't want you to stay. Because of me, I felt my chest tighten. I'm not leaving because of you. I replied, I'm leaving because I thought you didn't want me to stay. Hell let out a breath. The kind that comes from holding in too much for too long. I didn't know how to ask. He said, I've spent so long protecting myself from losing anyone else. I didn't realize I'd already started letting someone in there. It was the truth we'd both been circling for weeks, finally out in the open. And with it came a silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt full of possibility. He stepped closer, carefully, as if still unsure whether I would turn away. I don't want you to go, he admitted. Not unless it's what you really want. Looked at him, at this man who had quietly become part of my life, and felt my resolve waver. I do want more for myself, I said, trying to steady my voice. But I also want honesty, real connection. No walls. He nodded slowly. Then let's build something honest. No pressure, just something real together for the first time in what felt like years. I felt seen, not just as a worker or someone picking up the pieces, but as a woman, a human worthy of affection and belonging. We didn't embrace. Not right away. We stood there, in the quiet light of that big old house, letting years of pain, hesitation, and fear slowly melt away. I agreed to take the new job, but not leave the town. Not yet, and he offered more than just a goodbye. He offered a beginning. He asked if I'd come back for dinner the next week, just as two people getting to know each other again. I said yes, and that yes felt like the most courageous thing I'd done in years. From there, things unfolded. Gently, we talked more, spent time together, and shared simple moments that felt deeper than any grand gesture. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He played piano again. I began painting again. Something I hadn't done since before the divorce. We encouraged each other's growth, held space for the hard days, and laughed more than I thought I could love. I realized doesn't always arrive like lightning sometimes. It tiptoes in when you least expect it, through the quiet of cleaning a house, through shared grief, through a dinner, on a rainy night. And if you're lucky, it stays not to fix you, but to walk beside you as you find your way. This wasn't the life I thought I'd have. It wasn't the job I imagined when I set out to rebuild. But somehow in that unexpected house, I found something far more valuable than a paycheck. I found connection. I found hope. Found the quiet beginnings of love, and this time I wasn't afraid to let it